Let's take a step back now and reflect on what we've witnessed in Egypt over the last couple of days. It's dramatic, but is it democratic? In this new post-Arab Spring world, is the street always going to be just as important as the ballot box? We're joined from Toronto by Shereen El Feki, a close observer of social change in Arab societies and the author of Sex and the Citadel. And here in the studio by Dr. Azzam Tamimi, a Palestinian-born academic, supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood, friend of the former President Morsi, and Christian, well, we'll see what he makes of it from Tahrir Square, when we've had a bit of a chat this side. Let's start, first of all, with you, Shereen El Feki. Is this a step forward or a step backward?
I think it's a step forward on a very bumpy road. It is, to my mind, the best outcome given the circumstances. It's very few countries that go from decades of colonial occupation to decades of military dictatorship to a fully functioning liberal democracy in a single bound. We took a very unscenic detour over the past 2 years. I hope this people-powered army coup will put us back on track, but a lot of lessons will have to be learned by the army and by the opposition in order for that to happen.
Well, Dr. Tamimi, it is a rocky road, and it is a very big jump to go from a totalitarian Mubarak state to a fully functioning democracy. There are bound to be bumps. Is this a bump or is it a coup?
This is a coup, and no person claiming to be a Democrat would welcome a coup by the army. The 2011 revolution was about getting rid of the junta and the army that reigned in Egypt for so many decades and resulted in so much corruption. Mubarak came from the army. Before him, Sadat was from the army. Nasser was from the army. And they all persecuted and suppressed the Egyptian people.
But with respect, democracy is about much more than just the ballot box, isn't it? I mean, it's about how people function once they're in power. They have to respect and be inclusive, particularly in that very first moment after a totalitarian regime.
That's why in a democracy, people have to go to the ballot box every so many years, every so few years, because if you don't do well, the people will then bring you to judgment.
But you're talking like about a mature democracy like that in Britain. I mean, can you wait 4 years when people are being beaten up, when mistakes are being made very evidently, and inclusion is not really the message?
I think most of the Egyptian people would take offense with a statement like this, assuming that they are not mature or they cannot deal with democracy. That's not true. You see, what happened here is a coup perpetrated by groups who were infuriated that they did not win in the elections, and also people who collaborated from the remnants of the old regime.
Right. Well, let me just go to Toronto and then ask Shereen El Feki, what do you then make of the idea that the army, which after all had a massive vested interest in the economy, coming back into power again, however short-lived, they have a tremendous agenda of their own, which may not be that of the people?
That's absolutely true, and we are operating now in a time of hope over experience. Remember, when the Supreme Council of Armed Forces was in charge of Egypt in front of the curtain the last time we tried to make a transition from a president, they suffered. I mean, I was down in Tahrir Square when there were protests against the armed forces. Hopefully things will play out differently now. They have said that they have a roadmap. They have said they want to go to constitutional reform and elections, civilian elections, quickly. Now, it's key that those elections are inclusive. So, for example, moves to arrest members of the Muslim Brotherhood, to close down their media. I am hoping, as a liberal Muslim Egyptian, that this is a temporary measure. Because you're right, one measure of a democracy is a free election. And in the coming elections, the Muslim Brotherhood, President Morsi, clings to this notion that I was democratically elected, and that is the source of my legitimacy.
With respect,
personally, like millions of other Egyptians, I believe he threw out that legitimacy when he violated the principles of democracy.
But you've had an election, and you elected Mr. Morsi. You might not personally have, but surely the point here is what Egypt and the rest of the Arab Spring is telling us is that transition is not just about the ballot box, it's about the street. And the street on this occasion has brought the army back to try and, well, perhaps advance the ballot box.
but it's also how your democratically elected leaders behave. If they decide to call themselves Pharaoh until further notice and ride roughshod over the judiciary and throw protesters into prison and try to shut down journalists, then that violates the principles of democracy. In addition to that, the fact that the economy was running downhill rapidly and there was a lack of security on the streets, and President Morsi refused, really, only offered crumbs of compromise to the opposition.
Let me put all that.
This put us in this terrible position.
Let me put all that to Dr. Tamimi.
Well, I've never heard such bogus claims. There was not a single political prisoner under Morsi, not a single one.
I'm not sure Human Rights Watch would agree with you.
Well, get us their report then. Immediately after the statement was read by the leader of the coup, 300 Muslim Brotherhood leaders were being hunted and arrested. They're still arresting them. News channels were closed down. You cannot say this is a temporary measure.
But that surely is precisely what Shereen was getting at, which is that he did, in fact, really run the thing as if you had a total all-out majority. You didn't.
The exact opposite, actually. He was so powerless. He inherited a state whose institutions were still loyal to Mubarak. The army, the police, the judiciary, and the media was so anti-Morsi throughout the last year that they really managed to mislead so many people.
Well, those are two really starkly different and competing positions, Krishnan, and they're ones we've seen played out in two different parts of Cairo. Can you make head or tail of which of them is anywhere near the truth?
Well, the debate you're having there is exactly the debate that's happening here, but I think it's perfectly possible that democracy means something slightly different here to the way we may see it in London, Washington, or elsewhere in the West. The people here who regard this as a people's revolution supported by the army regard this as democracy because they see democracy as the will of the people, first and foremost, and if the will of the people is being seen through, then they're happy. I suppose the question is how this is going to be seen in the rest of the Arab world. In Tunisia, where Islamists hold power, they must be very worried. How are they seeing this in Syria right now, where Islamists, again, are part of that movement to overthrow President Assad, who had support, it seemed, from President Morsi, and that support has now gone. Egypt, remember, the scale of this country is so influential in this part of the world. Are we going to see what has happened here repeated in other parts of this world?
Krishnan and our two guests, thank you very much indeed, Shereen and Azzam Tamimi. Thank you very much indeed. I wish we'd had half an hour, but we didn't.